So let's get a couple points out of the way before we even dive into the subtopic. First, Nate put on here, no gain without pain. And that's a good point to bring up because
question mark.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
As a question mark, as a question. And that's, I think, a hard thing for a lot of writers to wrap their heads around. They feel like every work has to be completely deflating and they have to thrash themselves if they're going to see some fruitful benefit from it. And that's absolutely not the case. I mean, some athletes don't ever hurt themselves and only get faster.
Oh, yeah.
To a point.
Right.
So you don't have to associate gains of performance with painful workouts. It's not a necessity.
Something that Pete and I were mentioning to, actually we were discussing this just a couple weeks ago now with you.
Yeah.
We don't really feel much muscle soreness. I don't really feel a whole lot of it.
Yeah, and I'll explain that in a little bit.
I should say. Yeah. If I pick up strength training after not doing it for a long time.
Yep.
You've mentioned that, right, Sophia?
Oh my goodness, it hurts. But then you're like, wow, like when I'm riding, all these muscles are working. Like you don't really realize it when you don't have that muscle soreness.
Yeah,
exactly.
No, it's a wonderful thing to achieve.
Yeah.
And then I just want to draw a distinction between pain and soreness. I mean, being sore is one thing, being in pain is another. And I'm going to assume you're talking about soreness, but if it's pain, it needs to be addressed. Most likely going to involve a physician. Mm-hmm. If it's soreness, it should abate. If it eventually goes away, you're okay. Get back at it, and we'll talk very, very much about soreness.
Cool.
And then I'm also going to make the other assumption that we're talking about endurance training here, not strength training. Because I know strength training is kind of a hot topic with us lately, but I'm going to guess he's talking about endurance, and I'm going to roll with that assumption for about an hour. So buckle up. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that long. Okay, so what we are going to talk about is DOMS, D-O-M-S, delayed onset muscle soreness. Mm-hmm. And basically it's just that. It's delayed onset and your muscles hurt. It doesn't happen right away. It's typically about, I'll get more specific on this, it's later. Okay, mm-hmm. so not immediately after the workout. And what I found, so I was going to dive pretty deep into one particular theory because I didn't realize there were so many theories, and then really dive into the immune response because that's my personal hot topic lately, and I'm just itching to share my knowledge on this new area of interest. But I'm going to rein it back in, I guess, and discuss the other theories as well. So the first one and probably the most prominent theory is that of mechanical stress. Mm-hmm. And we hear about it all the time, muscle microtrauma. They're microscopic tears. You dealt with muscle trauma on a micro scale. And specifically what that is if you're familiar with muscle physiology, you get down to the muscles within the muscles, and we're talking about the overlapping myofilaments. You've probably heard about actin and myosin, maybe titin. And excuse me, all that happens is, like I said, they're muscles within muscles, and they're demarcated by what are called Z lines. And when you damage those Z lines, is apparently, or according to this theory, what causes the inflammation. The inflammation is the immune insult, and then the immune response is what causes DOMS.
Yeah.
The muscle soreness.
I think that's like similar. That's kind of like the. Is it fair to say that's the widely accepted theory? Because I feel like I've heard that one.
That's the one you see most, for sure. In fact, that's why I was going to run with this until I started digging into it and realized how many conflicting theories there were.
Oh, boy.
Which actually got really interesting. So I wouldn't be boring you with all of this. So the idea here is, and also I should mention that they typically tie this to eccentric contractions. So contractions that are taking place when the muscle is lengthening, rather than when the muscle is shortening, or in an isometric non-changing state. Mm-hmm. So muscles getting longer. This apparently lends itself to greater damage to these Z lines, to the sarcomeres, to the fibers, and initiates this whole immune response and the inflammation that comes with it. So their contention, or this model's contention, or theory's contention, is that it's fiber related too. So type 2s, because they can exert high force, can undergo greater damage, and it's the damage in your mechanical nociceptors, so the little pain sensors within your muscle that are eliciting or prompting the irritation and causing the pain.
Makes sense.
The brain's interpretation of it. And that type 1 fibers don't undergo this same level of damage because a couple of things: they have greater heat shock proteins. They have a lower mechanical stress limit. They can't exert as much force. Mm-hmm. So they just don't put themselves in the same position, supposedly. Problem is, DOMS can be accomplished via long, slow distance. There's plenty of evidence of it.
Yep,
plenty of people have gone through this.
Yeah, I've Everested before, actually. I felt it then.
Really?
Yeah,
absolutely.
She'll tell you all about it. Yeah.
So back to the inflammatory response. Typically, it happens within 45 minutes, peaks at about 2 hours, and this is when you look down, you start to see, and you can notice swelling, edema on the affected muscles, particularly the interstitial fluid. All the fluid that bathes the muscle fibers is pumping up, so to speak. The plasma is donating more fluid to it. This brings with it all sorts of immune response, phagocytes, macrophages, neutrophils, T lymphocytes, all things I was going to get into, talk about immune-mediated cell death and signaling of cytokines and all this interesting stuff that, again, I want to talk about, but couldn't get behind because I'm not sure I trust this theory. I don't think it's the strongest of the ones that I'm going to tell you about. So what they did show more often than not is that DOMS is not a direct result of muscle inflammation. You can have inflammation without pain. You can have pain without inflammation, maybe. So inflammation is there. There is muscle damage, but is that actually what's causing the muscle soreness? That's the question, and they can't answer it. They haven't got good answers. I think it's Delia, I don't know, Deyhle, in 2015 talked about repeated bouts. And so they do the initial exercise that made him sore, and then a few weeks later come back and do the same thing. And that's the repeated bout. And there was a great reduction in pain. They didn't have DOMS again, but they did still have the same level, if not a higher level of inflammation.
Oh, yeah.
So the inflammation was there, but the muscle soreness was not.
That's interesting because I've felt that before. Like, don't
See
go
it all the
hiking
time.
for a long time and then go hiking when you're just like this person that just rides a bike, like us.
Yeah.
And you'll be like crazy sore, but then you could go hiking again in 3 weeks or so, or a week, something like that. You don't get the same, pain feeling thereafter.
Yeah,
But
you might endure the same level of muscle trauma too. You might have the same level of immune response. You may have the same level of swelling, but the soreness magically isn't there.
I think weight training is a good example of that because on hiking it could be at the same intensity, but you still go to failure for your 8 reps or whatever. But I remember the first time I think you ever had it where you work out so hard where your arms are stuck. You can't put them out all the way.
I did. I did CrossFit, and we did what were the kipping pull-ups, and then I basically walked around like a T-Rex for like seriously a week.
CrossFit's easily the biggest offender, and they manage to do it in such a way that you experience this all the time. They fly in the face of all these theories somehow on how they do it.
DOMS year round. That's what you want.
In high school, I had this happen with my calves, and I had to walk on my tippy toes, no joke, for a week because I couldn't straighten them enough because they were so tight.
It extends out to there have been instances of as long as 10 days, 10-day effects.
Yeah.
Jeez,
so you can really overdo it.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so like I said, there's a number of theories going to talk about them, which tells you there's a high level of disagreement. There is agreement on certain things, and one of them is that inflammation does lead to adaptation. And this is why we don't want to blunt that inflammation with things like NSAIDs or antioxidant foods or antioxidant supplements, that sort of thing. We want to let the inflammation run its course so we get the benefit. Because when that happens, we're getting satellite cell activity. So on the outside of muscle cells, there are these little stem cells that will donate nuclei to the muscle so that it can form more cells. More cells mean more protein synthesis, bigger, stronger muscles, et cetera. And when we interrupt that inflammatory process, we're causing ourselves the very adaptation we're seeking. We've talked about that a number of times. So in addition, exercise-induced muscle damage alters gene expression. We've talked about that too, where when you strength train, when you do anything that pushes you, anything unfamiliar, it tells you which genes to switch on, which ones to switch off, and the signaling goes forward and adaptation follows.
Yeah, it's not static. That's something that we change.
Yep. But does this cause the muscle soreness? Does this inflammation, does any of this cause the muscle soreness? And one of the schools of opposition says that no, because low intensity work that comes with no or low inflammation can also lead to delayed onset muscle soreness. Another form of opposition comes in that there's metabolic causes and there's also psychological influences. So let's talk about the metabolic stress.
Cool.
There has been no demonstrated link between delayed onset muscle soreness and particular muscle metabolites. So what's the other side of metabolic processes, whether aerobic or anaerobic? These things, they can't find any of those in particular that causes delayed onset muscle soreness. DOMS, I'm just going to say DOMS from now on. But Pollock in 2014 showed that when protons are present, lactate's present, and ATP's present, all three are present at once, there was a correlation between that and muscle soreness.
Not saying that it's the cause, but there's a correlation.
The combination, it's multifaceted, and that's pretty much the whole gist of what I'm going to share with you, or am sharing with you. they also showed that there are molecules that are present before the workout and after the workout that could figure into it. So it's not just metabolites. It's not just outcome. It's stuff that comes in or starts the process or is there present prior to the process also. Growing evidence that reactive oxygen species or antioxidants have something to do with it, though it's not a direct cause. They can be present, they can be in high levels, but they don't necessarily correlate directly with muscle soreness. But there's something there. And then there's a 2008 study that showed that simple metabolic strain and long fatiguing endurance work, just go for a long time, creates DOMS.
Yeah.
Muscle soreness. And what was interesting about that is the DOMS was there, and therefore, the adaptation that followed and the repeat bout effect, which I'll talk about in a little bit, was also there, but there was no visible muscle damage. So now we don't even have damage, but we still have muscle soreness.
Yep.
Again.
Yeah.
So conclusion here is DOMS is not a direct result of metabolic stress either.
I'm confused.
We're lost.
I know.
Pull us out,
It
Chad.
gets worse. And I'm going to try to save it.
Oh, boy.
I don't know how well I'm going to do. Third theory, and I'm just going to touch on it briefly, is called the enzyme efflux theory. And it has to do with calcium accumulation, but I found that particularly interesting because there's a whole, I don't think it's a new school of thought, but there's a whole set of research that shows that muscle burn may be tied to calcium accumulation rather than blood acidification. I don't know. So I didn't dive too deeply into that, but I did want to note it.
Yeah.
And then the fourth theory is the lactic acid theory.
Which is very commonly
and
shared.
I'm just going to say no. Because if you haven't learned that by now, you're never going to learn it. And you're beyond hope, so give up.
Whoa,
Chad. I also want us to stop using the term lactic acid because it demonizes what lactate actually is. And for what it's worth, lactic acid is never present in the bloodstream anyway. Lactate and hydrogen are.
Yes.
But as soon as lactic acid touches the blood, or I don't know where in the process it happens, it dissociates into those two components.
Yes.
So you may have lactic acidosis in that those two components rise and cause an acidification of the blood, but it's not due to lactic acid, it's due to lactate and hydrogen.
Yes, exactly.
So anyway, no more lactic acid. Now when we're talking about endurance performance. And then two left. This fifth one, they purport that maybe it's a mild form of rhabdomyolysis.
I've wondered that too.
Yeah.
I've wondered if I'm stepping into the bounds of rhabdo.
Yeah, this one makes a little more sense to me.
What's rhabdo?
So rhabdo is when basically you endure, typically it's related to crushed muscle.
I was going to say
but
CrossFit.
It can also happen with...
What is it? CrossFit.
It can also happen with extreme workouts. It can also happen with really severe massage.
Yeah.
So, and basically what's happening is it's a form of kidney poisoning, and that there's too much myoglobin released from the damaged muscle, and the myoglobin itself, they can't measure the myoglobin. They measure what's called CPK, and you've probably seen this at some point in time, which is phosphocreatine kinase, and this is a good marker for exactly this sort of damage. So if your CPK levels are high, we can say, this is something that needs to be addressed. It's not something you want to experience all the time. And I think back to a buddy of mine was going to nationals, and he did a particularly hard workout a couple days prior, just a tune-up. Then he went to his sports physician, and his physician asked him after doing blood work, he's like, man, did you just get in a car crash or deal with some form of blunt force trauma because your CPK levels are off the charts? And he's like, no, I just did a couple hard workouts.
Yeah. And it's worth saying also, he's an incredible athlete that can go extremely deep.
He is. Yeah.
That's that guy. When I think of this athlete, that's his strength. He probably
can do that, and that's it too. And he has big power too. So he's asking a lot of those muscles.
Yeah. So when he says like just a couple hard workouts, I don't want people to think that they do a couple hard workouts and this is what they have.
No,
this guy is absolutely unique.
It's the extreme end of things.
Nationals multiple times to another.
Yes,
and he's 390 FTP,
and he's a big guy.
He's a big guy, and he still has. So he has times on Tour of California climbs that have come through that are still ranking like top 15, and he's a big guy.
We're talking about Scott Leland, so I'll just put the name out there.
Yeah, pretty impressive.
So this myoglobin's in high levels, and it's not a threat until it reaches the kidneys, at which point it can cause kidney damage, kidney failure, and that's why rhabdo is taken so seriously, because of the threat to the kidneys.
Yeah.
So the theory here is that it's a mild form of rhabdo.
Yep. Yeah.
And I think that one stands up. But the one I'm going to go ahead and hitch my wagons, wagon to, I guess is the term, is one that has to do with neurotrophic factors. And in this case, we're really talking about nerve growing pains. So neurotrophic factors are substances that are secreted by the muscles, and they basically spur nerve growth.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that there's an observable, what's called a mechanical hyperalgesia, which is just muscle pain, in observable muscle pain in the absence of visible damage. Again, touched on this earlier. So it says if the damage isn't there, it's obviously not causing the pain. We've kind of got to the point where it's clear that the inflammation is not causing the pain. So it's really, I mean, a whole pain in the brain sort of, pain is in the brain sort of argument. And the repeated bout effect supports this because there are a couple of really interesting studies. One that showed that it's not proportionate. They had one group of athletes do 10, they call them contractions, but we're talking repetitions, okay? So 10 repetitions or 20 repetitions or 50 repetitions. All of them dealt with a certain level of soreness. They came back 3 weeks later, all of them did 50 repetitions. All of them had the same level of soreness after those 50 repetitions, which wasn't much for what it's worth. So whether they did 10 repetitions in preparation for this 3 weeks later endeavor or the full 50, they all responded the same way in terms of the level of pain that they dealt with afterward. And then another one that's super interesting is when they train a single leg. They have a study, they've done studies where they train one side of the body, one leg, one arm, and the muscle soreness is felt in the other unexercised limb.
Whoa.
And then
it's crazy.
Weeks later, or during subsequent workouts, that muscle responds in the same way. It doesn't get sore. It's the worked limb overcame the soreness, and the unworked limb overcame the soreness, even though it didn't get exposed to the supposed stimulus.
You blew my mind.
Right?
Crazy?
How interesting is that?
That's nuts.
So all this,
single leg drills
these,
all day.
Yeah, you only need to do one of them. You have to do both.
No, just not to be sore.
Just
not to be sore. It's
Right.
not to say you got stronger in both legs, although there is some evidence to support that too, which is crazy.
More brain breaking.
Which just only furthers the point that there are no truths in science. Just knowledge.
Yeah.
It's just knowledge. All we're doing is informing ourselves, putting theories up there and trying to break them down. The longer they stand up, the stronger they become.
So what things, I guess, do you agree with on all of this?
Well, I don't agree with anything, or I do, but this is where the consensus lies.
Yeah.
One thing is that when it happens, typically peaks anywhere from 24 to 48 hours afterwards, but depending on the level of trauma, it can go out to 3 days. You can be dreadfully sore.
10 days.
Well, it can last that long, but typically it rises at about 24 hours. And if you've been through this enough times, you recognize if I'm this sore right now, tomorrow's going to suck.
Yes.
And very probably the third day is going to suck too, but maybe just a little bit less.
If I have an activity like that and I'm actually not really sore the next day, I'm like, oh no, it's going to be really bad. Tomorrow's going to be really bad.
Another area of agreement is that there's probably a genetic component, as there often is, in that they've recognized that certain athletes are very sensitive to this muscle soreness, and the intensity of the muscle soreness varies from athlete to athlete, even if they do the same thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then and this is general, but that it's aggravated by other stressors. But this is what leads me back to the whole brain-centered neurotrophic factor theory. So other forms of stress can have an impact on the severity of your delayed onset muscle soreness on DOMS. Dehydration being one of them, nutrition and the intake of your macros. Are you getting enough carbohydrate, enough protein, et cetera? So without being any more specific than that, they do impact it, or there's evidence to show. And then a really interesting one, and this just surfaced at the ACSM conference this year, is that your psychological headspace can really affect your level of muscle soreness, which is crazy. In particular, they had one group of athletes that had higher levels, or a group of athletes, and the ones who demonstrated higher levels of pre-levels of anxiety and depression actually had greater levels of muscle soreness post doing the same workout. Sleep deprivation, they've recognized that sleep deprivation elevates your sensitivity to pain, lowers your pain tolerance, and that too has had an impact on the severity of delayed onset muscle soreness. And then in 2012, PAR did a study where they told the subjects that you're going to be extremely sore. This is going to make you very sore. They basically tried to inspire fear in them.
Yeah.
And the ones who were more fearful of the workout took longer and took longer to heal and dealt with a higher level of muscle soreness afterward.
It's all in your head.
So much so that they could use the fear of injury to predict how long it would take them to recover from the exercise.
That's crazy.
So yeah, that's all in your head.
We should have like a workout where, well, I might be doing this to you already, where we just lie to you about your watts. So we say they're lower than they actually are, and you do them.
Just sowed that seed of doubt that we might.
But I mean, it's just like you.
We talked about that
you
last
get
week.
through more,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Like it's all in your brain.
Yeah,
And we
much is.
Quick aside,
And it's not all in your brain. It's just there's just a strong link between brain and body and brain.
Yes.
And it can't be underplayed.
Quick aside, we're always testing different versions of TrainerRoad, and at one point early on, we actually gave an employee a version of TrainerRoad that was actually displaying watts minus 50 or like minus 30 or something.
That was a joke.
And it was it was a total joke. And it was really hilarious actually to see how frustrated the rider was. But yeah.
To jump into your right here, I just heard of another study where they had strength athletes. They were trained for 6 weeks, and then they measured their gains in 6 weeks, and they told everyone, "Hey, take this pill. We're going to give you some steroids.
Yeah.
Go for another 6 weeks."
Yeah.
They had 3 times the amount of gains in that next 6 weeks. No one took steroids. It was all just sugar pills. Yeah, like placebos. But they thought they were on steroids, so they thought that like they're going to get more and be stronger and try harder.
I'm not surprised.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's fascinating, huh?
Okay, so I'm wrapping this up.
Yep.
There is so some areas where there is some agreement is that where the muscle soreness takes place, and it's typically only the affected muscle. But as we just discussed, train one leg and the other leg's mysteriously sore. So that kind of that's where there isn't agreement. That there's an intensity duration influence. But we've seen that.
Logical.
And then it's tied to the amount of mass recruited. And this I think this leaks to the neurotropic theory, in that the bigger the perceived threat to the brain, the more muscle that's affected, the greater the intensity of the muscle soreness and maybe the duration. The type of exercise is pretty much agreed upon, but it ranges. So, I mean, everything from high intensity down to low intensity, long duration. There is a consensus on that it's almost always unfamiliar. And there's usually an eccentric component, but that certainly doesn't stand up when it comes to cycling, because there's no eccentric contraction on a bicycle. It just isn't.
Yeah.
And then there is agreement on the fact that the ultimate outcome is the protective effect, or what we probably call it's adaptation, or what they call the repeated bout effect, which that you do the exercise once, and then later when you do it again, even if you up the ante, there's less swelling, there's less reduction in strength and the range of motion, and there's quicker recovery. We see adaptations at all the levels, whether it's neural, mechanical, or way down at the cell level.
So we let's say we have DOMs. Like, what do we do? Like, how do we deal with it? What are appropriate ways? Because I've seen people say, like, when you have DOMs, don't touch a foam roller and don't go to get a massage at all.
Yeah,
I've seen other people, you need to work it out.
They're all based on which theory you subscribe to. Yeah. So if you think it's muscle damage, then you're not going to want to roll your muscle damage or undergo a massage, because you're going to further the damage, right? This is muscle that's trying to heal, and you're going to get in there and work it. Yeah. But what if you think it's a metabolic cause or a neurotrophic cause? I mean, there's not even agreement on this. But, I mean, it really comes down to, I'll tell you some of the staunch don'ts. One is don't stretch, don't roll, or massage intensely. Yeah. Intensely being the key word there. Don't exercise intensely. Once again, intensely being the key word. Don't bother with all of these recovery modalities: cryo, icing, homeopathy, ultrasound, electric stimulation, Epsom salts, cherry juice, extra water, compression garbage. I meant garments. And there does seem to be some benefit, and it probably doesn't do any harm to undergo light activity, anything that makes the blood flow or moves the lymph around. But again, that subscribes to the inflammation end of things and not necessarily the DOM side of things.
Right. So who knows if it's actually effective, but at the very least, you're doing something.
Yep. In my personal opinion, and of all these studies that I read, all the reading I've done in the last couple of days and prior to this, is you simply have to get over it. You have to grin and bear it. The only thing that prevents DOMs is DOMs. Your body goes through it once, and then it gets better at enduring it in the future or avoiding it entirely.
So is muscle pain during recovery proportional to the training load or quality? No.
Yeah, not necessarily.
Yeah,
I can't conclusively say yes or no.
Yeah, just because another person is more sore doesn't mean that they are training more. Just because you're more sore or less sore.
Or Yep.
Exactly.
Is it Amylase?
Yeah, Amylase. Yeah, I would.
No hard answer there, buddy.
Look what you've done.
He's got lots of info. Once again, no truth, just knowledge.
Well, Sophia, you're the highest level here. Do you get sore after every single workout?
No. And if anything, it's like, at least for nationals, like I had a specific national workout that I did. And the first time I did it, I was like, okay, this was a little hard. Like, power numbers weren't great. But then the second time I went out, I was better. And then the third time it was like better. And then we increased it up a little bit more. So it's kind of like just anytime you're starting to do something for the first time, your body's not used to it. So it's like, oh, what's going on?
Brain.
You know, like I started doing threshold stuff on the flats. I never do that. I always do it on the climb, and my body's like, whoa, this is really, really hard.
It's weird how different it is.
Yeah, so it's kind of just, it's something new, and, you know, just know if you're feeling the fatigue, you're getting stronger at the end of the day.
Yeah, you just got to get your brain to loosen the leash.
Yep. Yeah.